As we speak this morning, right now, Republican senators are casting secret ballots for their new majority leader in the upper chamber. Their options are the very enticing trio of John Thune, John Cornyn, and Rick Scott. I said that sarcastically, obviously, but it looks like right now there's some leaks coming out of the meeting, which is happening again as we're speaking. It looks like it's going to be John Cornyn. That could obviously change. So why does any of this matter? There are some obvious reasons and then some less obvious ones too. With a majority in the Senate and likely majority in the House, Republicans will be able to pass major legislation when Donald Trump is inaugurated in January. The Senate confirms cabinet and court nominations. The majority leader sets the tone and makes procedural decisions with massive consequences, even if all of this is often obfuscated by very confusing inside baseball. Here's how our friend Rachel Bovard, a longtime Senate staffer, including on the steering committee, put it in the Federalist yesterday, channeling what I think is fair to say the broader sentiments of the conservative world. Rachel wrote, quote, "For Senate Republicans, this means closing the book on the Mitch McConnell era of governance marked by heavily centralized management and open hostility to the Trump agenda and the Republican base. On November 13th, they will elect a new leader for the first time in nearly 18 years and have a chance to usher in a new leadership that is accountable to the conference and the priorities of the evolving base of the Republican Party." So the majority leader is the party's chief negotiator. If he won't go to the mat for, let's say, cutting Ukraine funding or a hardcore border bill, MAGA senators and Donald Trump can't do that much about it other than exert public pressure, which is powerful, and then play hardball in smoke-filled back rooms. So why is this a problem for Republicans? Trump is claiming a mandate, so why would any of the options for majority leader be a thorn in his side on these issues? John Thune and John Cornyn are longtime allies of Mitch McConnell, who has made no secret of his personal disdain for Trump. Thune and Cornyn, both from red states, joined the Senate in the Bush years. Rick Scott entered politics as Florida governor in the Tea Party wave and then joined the Senate in 2019, where he quickly aligned himself with the MAGA movement. In 2022, as McConnell insisted on his tradition of not releasing a policy agenda, Scott sought to fill that vacuum with a plan to rescue America. That was what it was called. He courted conservative thinkers and journalists, including myself, seeking to establish himself as the populist alternative to McConnell, operating on the understanding that McConnell was ailing and also deeply unpopular. At the time, Scott was talking to people, again, I had conversations with him about all of this, really laying the groundwork, and it was a clever move. He was buying goodwill with people who would be in positions to offer public support of him, including people in the Senate, including people in the media. But backlash over the plan's points on the social safety net, which were used by Democrats in their campaigns, brought about a consensus in some Republican circles, actually in Republican circles generally, that Scott was kind of in over his head, got ahead of his skis. Nevertheless, after the GOP's disappointing 2022 midterms, Scott scored 10 votes in the secret ballot election for Senate leader. McConnell still got 37, but picking off 10 was pretty impressive, given that a lot of senators were being publicly asked by reporters to say how they voted. National media is now acting like Rick Scott's challenge basically came out of nowhere. It did not. He has been laying the groundwork for this over the course of several years. And sensing an opportunity to either change leadership or pressure them to be better, Mike Lee really followed in the footsteps of the House Freedom Caucus recently. The Freedom Caucus obviously pushed Kevin McCarthy to make all kinds of concessions in exchange for their votes for his speakership. And Lee put out a list of parliamentary demands to empower conservatives. He's been working hard in public and private to push the list and to push Rick Scott's bid. The demands are super granular, they sound super granular, but would be pretty consequential. Lee wants 4 weeks of time for debating and amending omnibus bills. He wants a floor schedule for appropriations. He wants to reform something called filling the tree in the amendment process, and he wants term limits on leaders and then goals to be stated upfront every year. Trump himself has treated the question of recess appointments as a litmus test for the next leader. Ryan and I had talked about that earlier in the show. Getting through recess appointments would allow him to fill up his cabinet quickly and without pushing members to take controversial votes. Now, it's all similar stuff to what happened with Kevin McCarthy, demands that kind of harken back to the Tea Party years when conservatives were demanding leadership listen to the base. Lee, of course, would arguably be a better and more appealing and charismatic leader than Rick Scott himself, but Lee's libertarian/populist streak means he almost surely would not be able to secure enough votes from a conference that still includes centrists like Susan Collins. Earlier this year, Donald Trump Jr. tweeted, quote, "Rhino Senators John Thune and John Cornyn both want to replace Mitch McConnell. Once he finally gets put out to pasture, both of them also voted to send billions more to Ukraine. MAGA must do everything in our power to stop either of these rhinos from ever becoming Senate leader." Both men are seen as being aligned with more of the donor class than the base on foreign policy and the border, voting as Ukraine hawks and supporting Senator James Lankford's Trojan horse McConnell-pushed border deal earlier this year. To say the very least, they are out of step with most Republican voters, but just about anyone in a leadership position in Congress is going to be, which is why the bench of potential successors to McConnell isn't very deep. It's either two friends of his or the one guy crazy enough to take those guys on. Rick Scott is not perfect, but he's made a political calculation that populism is where the votes are. So that means the MAGA agenda will clearly be better off with him in power, even if he's an unlikable ambassador for the cause and struggles to actually get anything done. Now, those are both serious problems. And recognizing Scott's odds, MAGA operators in the conservative movement seem to have secured some concessions from John Cornyn, who's politically ambitious enough to recognize that it's wise to pull a little bit of a McCarthy here and give those guys something. Just last night, he released a Dear Colleague letter saying that he's with Rick Scott and actually with Mike Lee on some of those priorities about how they could reform Senate procedures. So if MAGA world, if conservatives can defeat John Thune, it'll be a win either way for MAGA, which would have simply gotten nothing if Lee hadn't mounted this effort behind the scenes. And it's a win for actual conservative voters, by the way, who will also now have a little bit more of a voice in D.C., whether you like MAGA populists or not. This will empower anti-establishment voices. The real question now is just how much it will empower them. So Ryan, you've covered the Senate for a really long time. Some of this is actually left over from the Harry Reid era. You covered Harry Reid very closely. Filling the tree, I think, is a process that Harry Reid was sort of a pioneer of, at least in recent history. So I'm curious from the perspective of somebody on the left, the anti-establishment wing of the Democratic Party has played a little bit more nicely with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and now Hakeem Jeffries than the Freedom Caucus guys and Ted Cruz and Mike Lee did, especially in the Tea Party era, Rand Paul as well. Some of this sounds great even from like a bipartisan perspective, like actually having 4 weeks of debate on omnibus bills, having your party leader say what your goals are at the beginning of every year. I don't know, it actually just seems like a way to make the Senate work better.
Right, but just like the Freedom Caucus reforms that they successfully extracted, you know, when the rubber hits the road, they get tossed out. Like bills still get put on the floor and moved quickly through, despite promises that, oh, you'll get 72 hours to look, everybody will get to amend. Like all of these promises that they make about, you know, democracy end up kind of just getting tossed out when in reality. But yes, from a just small d Democratic perspective, it would be nice if we had democratic institutions again.
Yeah. No,
like,
I mean, yeah.
Like, at some point, you're like, hold on. You've got the president, the Supreme Court, and Congress. And then if Congress is run by 4 people who are all from red or blue states and basically cannot be voted out. So the 4 people being, you know, the House Democratic leader, House Republican leader, Senate Democratic leader, Senate Republican leader. They call them the firm. Those are the big. They call them the big 4. Then the only way that you can, as a voter, influence power is by switching parties from Republican to Democratic.
Yeah.
Since none of the representatives or senators have any power, because they're just at the, you know, they're just at the whim of this big 4. Like, how different is that than China? Like in China, like, you know, the government is responsive to people's will, not through democratic elections, because they don't want to get overthrown. They want to make people happy. They want to keep prices low. They want to keep the economy growing.
Yeah, I'd rather have elections.
Sure, but if all your elections can do is narrowed down to this tiny margin it's not that impressive of a system from a democratic perspective.
So a lot of the objectionable foreign policy that most voters would say, if you put this in front of me in a ballot referendum, I would vote it down. Most of that gets packed into these omnibus bills that aren't really debated on. So the senators just say, this was my leverage at the last minute. That's just what we had to do to get this other priority. And if you have more debate on omnibus bills, you probably will get a slightly more representative foreign policy because senators will have to take a little bit more heat for having these conversations in public. So that's at least, I mean, Cornyn last night, literally last night, came around and he put out a Dear Colleague letter essentially agreeing with a lot of the tenets of the Lee plan that Rick Scott had pushed. And so a source told me basically this is a win for us either way as long as it's not John Thune. So if they come out of this with either Rick Scott or John Cornyn, the Mike Lee wing, the conservative wing, is going to feel pretty good about it, even though people like Ted Cruz do have longtime connections with Thune because he was a McConnell, he's obviously a McConnell ally, a McConnell deputy. You had to have good relationships with him. You had to make inroads with him in order to get anything done, which, I mean, Rick Scott, how much can he get done? He's, broadly disliked by a lot of people, and he's putting out things about how he was a business leader, trying to convince some of the establishment people to come over to him because he was a business leader. And now you and I could talk about his record as a business leader.
He oversaw basically the greatest Medicare fraud in the history of the United States. Somehow is not in prison, and instead is on the cusp of being, Senate Majority Leader. John Cornyn, is an old school Chamber of Commerce Democrat from Texas. And
Republican,
Yeah. Did I say Democrat?
You said Democrat. But a lot of people on the right would be like, yeah.
Well, he would have been a Democrat in the 60s, 70s from Texas. Yeah. Actually, he may even have been when he was younger because it was a one-party state. But it was a Democratic state back when LBJ was around. He has spent decades, or at least close to 2 decades, raising money for his colleagues in the Senate Republican Conference, and is very attentive to their needs and is well liked by them. And so if he wins, it'll be because that old school method of winning power still works. When these people were running for the Senate for the first time, he was there in their district, raising money for them, connecting them with donors, making sure they won. And people feel a real loyalty for that. When Rick Scott was in charge of electing senators, he put out some stupid plan where he was going to tax half the country.
It was entitlements that people were like, you're cutting Social Security.
Yeah, what are you doing?
Yeah.
You're making it harder for us to win an election rather than easier, when your job is to make it easier. If Rick Scott sneaks through, it'll be because the establishment split their votes between Thune and Cornyn, which would be an impressive own goal on their part.
Right. Yeah, and a couple other things to mention. Trump has so far stayed out of the race, and obviously they're voting now. Even J.D. Vance, who's there
Trump
for the vote.
wing is very clearly Rick Scott.
Yes. Although, Cornyn is obviously trying to be really friendly with those folks. And I think Trump just wants whoever wins. That's probably the correct theory as to why he stayed out of it. J.D. Vance wouldn't say who he was voting for, according to at least the earlier reports we're getting who he was supporting when he came to the Senate today. So Trump is on Capitol Hill today. He's actually going to talk to people. He's going to the White House today. That's another important, subplot in today's crazy news cycle with all of the appointments and all of this going on. But Mitch McConnell is the longest serving party leader in the history of the Senate. So that's why this is extremely consequential. Thune and Cornyn had a lot of negative things to say about Donald Trump over the years when it came to things like the Access Hollywood tape. Obviously, they voted differently than a lot of the MAGA wing would want them to on Ukraine. So there's this real deep-seated fear that they will do everything they can to undermine the goals of the MAGA agenda when it's actually rubber meets the road in legislation. And even just as they're fundraising and negotiating and all of that stuff, Mitch McConnell is seen as somebody who, going back to the Tea Party years, was undercutting the hard right in fundraising and at his Senate Leadership Fund and with those various groups. So it's a pretty consequential position and definitely a new era in the GOP. Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.